you, I think, here. Alain doesn't need an introduction, but there are one or two people who have not met him before or are meeting him for the first time. Alain has known of Mayor Barber consciously for 56 years, but who knows how many other years before then. And he had the great good fortune to spend some weeks with Barber and all the Mandali in Marizal in the early years, and has many, many wonderful stories to tell. He works as a psychotherapist in London and various places around the globe, and is a wonderful and dear friend. So over to you, Alain.
Thank you. Thank you. May I ask, please, two favours of you. One is that almost 57 years with Barber, there are lots of stories, and I'm sure I could very easily overrun. So will someone monitor, because you all want lunch and hunger always gets in the way. Barber taught me that one. And may I also ask, please, for you, when we get to the end, please don't applaud, but think, have I given you, hopefully, a little something from Barber? Just sit there in silence and give yourself to Barber. And I think it's just absolutely wonderful sometimes. Yes, of course we want to applaud. It's a natural thing. We are taught to do it. It's a cultural thing. But sometimes it's just lovely just to be able to sit and say, was there anything there? Did anything take place? So may I ask that of you, that you sit in silence rather than applaud. I'm doing, for the first time, a different way of talking about Barber today. As my dear friend Sue mentioned, I work and live on an international basis and have done even before I met Barber. And always, Americans especially, but always people say, but yes, where are you from? Well, that's a question I can't answer. But basically, from a social point of view, I grew up as a tiny child in England during the war. What little I know about it, and it's very little, my father worked on very secret projects about 6 miles from our house in a special environment. And nobody ever talks about it. There are people who are in their 90s who work next to each other in these various environments doing secret work during the Second World War. They've never talked about it, and they're in their 90s now. I've met a couple of them. And so I have no idea what he did. My mother was trained as a concert pianist, but she was never allowed to perform because her father, being a strict Victorian, said no daughter of mine will ever appear on the stage, type of things, for those of you who are English and get that English piece. I spent early years in an isolated house, and this is where Barber comes into my life for the first time. I must have been about 3 or 4, I'm not sure how old I was, and Hazrat Inayat Khan's daughter, who was parachuted in behind the lines as a spy in France, came through our house, because our house was the path, I didn't know this until many years later, to the airport, so they could go to the airport. There's an aerodrome, which is very near our house, and so that was my first beginning spiritual lesson. And I remember her smile. Unfortunately, I found out fairly recently that she did some very silly things, and a lot of people died because of it, but she was always somebody in the back of my mind. In my family, you went to church. No ifs, no ands, no buts. And you went to the Baptist church, you went to the Anglican church, you went to the Universal church, you went to the Methodist, and I tried them all. And I suppose from about the age of 7 onwards, didn't think about it at the time, didn't realise what was going on, I was sexually molested. And it obviously had a bearing on my life and where I went and what happened to me. When I was 12, my father was murdered, and I was given to family members to be brought up, and I was also there physically abused, as I was unfortunately by my father, very severely physically abused. And I kept on my journey somehow, and I went to school at St Martin's in the Fields, which was then a very small choir school. It no longer exists. And when I was 14 3/4, proud, the headmaster took me aside and said, you've done all the courses, what are you going to do for the next year? And I said, leave. very precocious. I mean, you've got to remember, we're talking about back in the 50s. We're not talking about now, where we have so much more freedom. And this is what I wanted to share, because it's very germane to what Barbara did with me and for me. And so, my maternal grandmother has said to me, I will pay for you to go to university if you want to go. And I went to see her and I said, can I have some money? I want to go travelling. I remember I'm 14 3/4. And she was totally gobsmacked and thought I was joking. So she gave me a cheque and I took it to Coutts Bank, which is in Charing Cross, it's still there, and cashed it. And bank manager had to come out and ask what a 14 3/4-year-old was doing cashing this very large cheque. I got traveller's cheques and I walked across the road and got on the train and never came back to England. My journey with Barbara again. I had a career in show business. I worked literally all over Europe. I worked behind the Iron Curtain. I got kissed by Bulgarian and Khrushchev when I was in Eastern Europe. I appeared in films in Spain. I worked at the very famous Moulin Rouge in Paris and the Lido, and a very, very wild nightclub called the Sexy, which later became the Crazy Horse Saloon, which for any of you who know is another one of these outrageous places. And in 1958, on July the 14th, I was in one of the areas of Paris that was celebrating madly Bastille Day, and this very tall, very elegant, very handsome man, in the most atrocious French, said to me, "Excusez-moi, mais je suis perdu." And his name was Don Stevens. And he was completely lost, and of course it was a complete madhouse because everybody was dancing and singing and drinking and carrying on. French are very good at carrying on at big wild parties. And so I guided him back to his hotel, which of course was the Meurice on the Rue de Rivoli. And he said, "Oh, can I invite you to dinner?" And so I said, "Well, no, I'm in show business and I will be working tonight." And that was the start of an 11.5-year romance. And we spent time catching up in a variety of ways. And I lived in what used to be called a maid's room in a little hotel that Oscar Wilde had lived in. And I had a tiny little room and we had a shared bathroom with the floor below. And it was just a wild and amazing life, and I met all sorts of people. From Picasso upwards or downwards, however you want to see it. I had no idea what it was all about. I'm sorry. I was so naive. And I have young clients at the moment who are 16 and 17. I'm working with a lot of young women who cut themselves. It's become suddenly one of the things I'm very much involved in. And I listened to their conversation and I thought, God, I didn't get to that point till I was 26 or 27. And they're 15, 16 and 17. So it was a very strange time. And Don finally said he would like me to come live with him. And we worked it out that he was setting up an office in The Hague. And I would go and be sort of secretary, head cook, bottle washer, whatever the bits and pieces were that I could do legitimately so I could have a visa to stay in The Hague. And so that's what we did. And here comes Barbara into the picture again. And one day Don said, Marcia de Deuce is coming on her way to Saudi Arabia with her husband, Terry, who was then head of Aramco, which is the Arabian American oil company. And she unfortunately used to get sick flying. And I had this first vision of this extraordinarily powerful woman laying in a bed in the Vitterbrook Hotel, beautifully coiffed, with an amazing smile, an amazing lipstick. And she was the first person outside of Don who'd mentioned Barbara to me. And she had such clarity as to what Barbara was that my curiosity was piqued. And I've been living with Don for about 7 months in Holland. And a letter came, and Don came into my room. His bedroom was there, my room was there, and the study was there. And he said, "You have a letter from Barbara." And I thought, why could Barbara send me a letter? And he said, go ahead and open it. And so I opened it, and it was a letter, obviously written by Mummy, so please don't misinterpret, but it was from Papa, asking me if I would accompany Don to see him at Christmas. And it is so important because these things get, as I've seen so many times in subsequent years, taken out of context. But I was so flabbergasted from what little I knew, and it was little. And I also have to say I was a little bit apprehensive about this man and Don's involvement with him, and felt a little bit protective of Don, and maybe this was not the path or the right thing. So I immediately said, yes, I'll go, not knowing what I was going to get. And that Christmas we went, and I've told this story many times before, so I'm going to cut it very short. The piece that was so amazing was just getting to India. And I had a facsimile of it last night when I left here. Yesterday, I was in bliss here. I was just absolutely barbered out. It was wonderful. And several people said, can we help you? Can we get you a lift? Can we, whatever? And I said, no, I wanted to be grounded. And I went around the corner to catch the bus, which was very easy for me. I waited half an hour. No bus came. I took a taxi, and 40 pounds later I got home, and an hour later. And I said, Maya's doing it again. It's the same thing as when I went to Barber. I spent a week. And again, it's very difficult for people to understand. Now we have computers, we press buttons and things all come into place. In those days, if you wanted an airline ticket, and there weren't 5 flights every 5 minutes to Bombay or Delhi or wherever else, there were 2 or 3 a week. You had to go to the individual airline office. And Don was in very important negotiations. And I went every day. He would come back and say, I'm sorry, we can't leave tomorrow, but we could leave maybe the next day, so will you take the tickets and go and see what you can do? And I'd trudge up and down the Champs-Élysées, because that's where all the airline offices were, changing all the flights, and you didn't have to pay £40 or £180, you just changed the flight. Well, eventually we left, but there was an accident in Rome, and we got delayed, and it truly was, I think, the absolute worst journey of my life, and I've had some pretty hectic ones, but that one was really awful. And we arrived in India, and there was a big party at the airport because Don, of course, was very well known and very well respected, and being a businessman and an American businessman gave him a cachet, and it was a fabulous party. And then we piled into the DeSoto, and I have a memory, and again this is my story, I have a memory that it only took us an hour and a half, 2 hours to get from the airport to Pune, to the hotel we were to stay in. Now it takes 4 hours, if you're lucky, and we've got a motorway. So we arrived at the hotel, and we stopped at the hotel, and then the next day, very early, we left, and we arrived in Marathon, and I think the best word I could do, I was emotionally anxious, because on one hand, I was quite fascinated. I'd seen pictures. Don had done absolutely no proselytizing whatsoever about Baba. He had told me stories, he had shared things with me, but you know, it hadn't quite taken, the seed hadn't really grown. And so I got out of the car and was wandering around, and Mayor G was being very efficient, saying do this, do that, and that. And he said to me, just go in Mandalay Hall. And I thought, well, whatever Mandalay Hall is. So, and then he said, take off my shoes. And as I walked in the door, at the other end, it was like a sunburst. I have never felt, ever before or since, such extraordinary energy, such extraordinary love. I was totally and utterly overwhelmed. And I sank to the floor, crying, and the next thing I knew was Baba was physically picking me up. And when I say picking me up, I mean, however, I wasn't the fatty that I am now, or the pleasingly plump or whatever. I was very skinny, I weighed 98 pounds. Baba, even though he couldn't walk properly at that point, came and physically lifted me up. And I just howled. That was the only thing I could think to do. And it was like rainbows. And later on, when I was working with drug people in San Francisco, and they would describe some of these colors and textures, I think, yes, you've got the spiritual piece, you've got it the wrong way, because that's exactly what it was like for me. It was like rainbows, it was like explosions of colours, and they have new things they have on computers now, and I can't remember what they're called, but they...
Fractals.
Fractals, thank you. And that's exactly what it was like when Barbara picked me up. And Barbara held me, and when I say Barbara held me, I'm sorry, I can't even begin to describe that energy. I can't even begin to... Now, Barbara was, physically from my perspective, frail at that time. But the power and the energy that surrounded me, I don't know whether it was 10 minutes, 10 hours, 10 days, it was an extraordinary experience. And then Erich helped Barbara to his chair, and I sat just slightly to the side. And Don came in, and Don and Barbara had, my turn, a conversation, and everything was brought up to date. And Barbara would just reach out and touch me very, very gently. But the power was extraordinary, and that's the thing I would love for all of you to have a beginning understanding of. His emotional, physiological, spiritual, intellectual power is extraordinary. It's just so far beyond anything. Don and I were put into Dr. Duncan's cottage for 2 nights, and I was just completely and utterly, only way I can describe it, as an emotional wreck. And I didn't know which was up and which was down, and I didn't know what to do or how to do it, and it was totally amazing. So the next day we had DeSoto car, never forget the blue DeSoto car. And we went over to Mehrabad again, and we went in, and Baba came in and sat down in his chair, and he made it very clear and very obvious I was to sit absolutely right next to him on his right hand side, sorry, I'm getting it reversed, left hand side. And all the men Mandalay were sitting there, and every time I moved slightly, Baba would sort of pull me back. So I literally was in physical contact as much as you could through the arm of his chair. And he was just so caring, because in the very simplest sense of the word, literally after the greeting, Baba would say, have you slept well? Did you eat properly? Have you been to the bathroom? Are you comfortable? And I just thought, in my naive way, that this was just being very gracious and very loving, which of course it was. But there was much more to it than that, and it was one of the important lessons for me, because Baba was saying, are you here? Are you present? Are you ready? I had no idea what I was ready for. I didn't know what I was there for. And Baba, the second day we were there, sat down with Don and myself and Erich, who was obviously doing the translation, and wanted to know all about me. And I found that extremely, extremely difficult. I found it very uncanny, and he wanted to know about some of my experiences, and I shared. I was totally honest about it. And to my utter amazement, Baba wasn't shocked. He wasn't saying, oh, well, I think you better go, I can't have you around me, we're too pure, we're too spiritual, you can't be here. And I had a recollection of this, which I'm going to do a little deviation and share with you. I have a woman I've been working with for many, many moons, and I've always had the sense that there was something she hadn't told me. And I've tried all my techniques that I knew on some borrowed techniques, but nothing ever worked, so nothing ever came out. And I just finally said, oh, I must be absolutely crazy, and there's nothing there. And she came to see me 3 weeks ago and sat down and sat very quietly like this and said, I have something I have to tell you and I have to share with you, and I think you're going to ask me to leave and you won't ever work with me again when I tell you, and my mind went, oh my God, what has she done? Has she murdered a child? And I mean, it had to be something terrible. And this is the point of the story. She finally said to me that when she was 11, she was, quote, raped by her cousin who was 13. And she is, I think, 72 now, and she'd never ever told anybody. So she'd lived the whole of her life with this piece. And she was ready to pick up her handbag and run out of the door because she was sure. And I said, you know, I think this is the most marvellous moment in your life because you're absolutely free. And that was exactly the very big first lesson, or the second lesson, that Barbara gave me, was you had to be free, you had to have your own truth, you had to have your own awareness. There's no point, and there's certainly no point in sitting with Barbara and hiding, because he would get it straight away. So, there's just so much that took place in that very short period of time. Number one, it was the end of a period of complete seclusion. Nobody had been to see Barbara. He'd been doing his work. We were sitting there one day, and Barbara loved jokes. I think everybody knows that, but he would occasionally tap me on the shoulder and say, joke. And I think, oh my God, I've never been any good at jokes. And I would come up with the silliest schoolboy type jokes, because that was all I could think of. Barbara thought those were great, so I was very happy. But I used to rack my brains and think, oh, I hope he doesn't ask me today for a joke. I haven't got one, but I generally found one. So we would sit there, and then the third day we were there, it was the first time where I ever felt, from my perspective, that Barbara was being confronted with me. Because he said to me, why are you so thin? And I said, oh, because I'm very active, and I've been ill with a couple of things. And Barbara said, and everybody went, and he went, and nothing happened. And he did it a third time, even louder. And he said, chapatis. Well, I'm sorry, I didn't really know what a chapati, I mean, I'm really missed out, and I didn't even know a chapati was a slice of white bread. And so, in comes Little Khorshid, and Barbara gives the orders, and Little Khorshid just suddenly out of nowhere gives me this great big hug, and that was it, that was the beginning of our relationship. And off she goes, and about 5 minutes later, Barbara stands up and indicates, and all these poor men Mandalay, I mean, they're there for spiritual growth and development, and they have to come outside and watch me eat 3 chapatis laden with ghee and laden with jaggery. And Barbara made me eat all 3. And that became the routine every morning. So I used to feel so embarrassed. Barbara was very good at nicely embarrassing one, but I had them, and as it was then, there was this great long walk, which there isn't now in the same way. And at the corner was the little old lady who made chapatis. That was her job, and she had a little stone thing, and she sat there and made chapatis. And Barbara would make us walk out. Don and I, on the third day, moved into the room right opposite Mandalay Hall. And we were sitting with Barbara one day, and it happened so fast, you didn't realise it was happening, but you sort of really got a sense of Barbara, you got a sense of the gestures, and I'm not saying I could interpret, but you got a sense. And I had a sense that Barbara was being mischievous. And so he looked at Don and he said, Don, if I ring the bell in the middle of the night, what do you do? And but Don said, well, Barbara, of course I come. And he looked at me and he said, and what do you do? And I said, I get dressed and come. And he said, no, you come in your underpants. And it was like, this is little moving awareness, touching you, making you feel. And it was just absolutely stunning. Another day we were sitting there, and this is perhaps for me the most serious and the most poignant part. And Don told everybody to go out and have tea, pee, whatever. And Don and I were sitting there, and Erich was there. And Barbara looked at Don and said, you're responsible for Alain. He is the heart and you are the head of this relationship. You have a responsibility, you must do things for him. I will tell you what to do and you must know what to do. And years later, and I'm sorry if this sounds pretentious, it's not meant to be, it was like a wedding. It was like Barbara was giving us something that was so unique and special and telling us how we were to be with each other. And he went through a list of things that I was to do for Don and I was responsible for, and the things that Don had to do for me. And it was very, very powerful. And after this was over, we broke up for lunch. And I had 2 terrible allergies in those days. I know food allergies are very fashionable now, but in those days you didn't have food allergies. I did. I couldn't eat onions. You can't go to India and not eat onions. I mean, that's so ridiculous. It didn't matter. I didn't have onions. And I couldn't eat, still can't eat red or yellow or green peppers. And Barbara used to say, right, what do you want for lunch tomorrow? What do you do when God asks you what you want for lunch tomorrow? Could I please have the moon on toast? And he expected an answer. I mean, it really was this is the whole point. Everything that Barbara did, in my experience, was absolutely genuine. It wasn't a game, it wasn't a joke. He wanted to know what you wanted to know. I mean, real banal stuff. What do you want for lunch? Well, this is Ahmednagar. This is 1959, 1960. You know what I asked for? Fish. Didn't dawn on me. I mean, 20 years old and I use buckets. It didn't dawn. You don't get fish in Ahmednagar. Next day for lunch, what did I have? Fish. Fish. The most extraordinary fish. But there's a key point here. Little Caution, who used to do a lot of the cooking, came out, and I used to sit on the little terrace. Don sometimes would go off and do things with Barbara or Erich, and I'd sometimes have lunch alone. Barbara came out, walked out with Kakabad, and came out and put his finger in the food. And my first reaction, I'm sure many of you can imagine, perhaps some of the older people here can imagine, was how rude! You don't stick your finger in people's food. And then I realised this wasn't an ordinary person, this was Barbara. And Barbara looked at me and made the sign for delicious. He'd rub his thumb across 5 fingers and it was delicious. It was. And I ate it and I realised afterwards I'd eaten all the bones as well. I was completely unconscious. It was a sunfish. And sunfish have fairly chunky bones. And another piece that was really fascinating was these trousers I'm wearing today are replicas of the trousers that I wore when I was with Barbara. And I had, in those days, my blues and my yellows and my greens and my pinks. And I trotted across one morning, and I didn't bring it today. I thought it would be a little bit much. Don and I had to stay the night in Pakistan because of all these dramas with flights. And we'd been going around in a car being driven around, and we'd seen a mast, one of the first I was ever to see. And we did, quote, the little shopping that one does, and I bought a beautiful Karakala lamb hat. And Barbara had heard of this hat, and so he asked me to wear the hat. So I would wear the hat, and I would go in the morning, and if I didn't have the hat on, Barbara would go. So I'd have to go back to the room, put on my little hat, because it made everybody laugh, because it was a Pakistani hat, not an Indian hat. And in those days, relationships were really pretty bad between Pakistan and India. And one morning I went over, and I was wearing, this is why I wore the blue replicas today, and I had a blue shirt on, and blue socks, and blue trousers, and a blue scarf. And I came in and the men were all sitting there and they'd obviously been having a really deep and very powerful, powerful discussion. You just could feel the energy. And Barbara just stopped totally abruptly, tapped me and said, "Gentlemen, look at this young man. He doesn't know me. He's just found me. But he loves me. Does he come in dirty white dhotis? No, he comes in beautiful colours. He comes in and he wants to make us feel alive, and he cares for us. I wanted to sink into the floor. I mean, there's all these wonderful men, and they're all in the book, so you can, all the names are there. And Baba used to do that over and over again. If I came in yellow, he'd comment on the yellow. If I came in pink, you see, he's wearing my colours, he's mine. And it was literally, so I just got used to it and decided, go with the flow. This is wonderful, this is very effective. One of the other things around Baba that took place at that time was Baba was beginning to walk. And he and Francis used to walk up and down this long walkway, which is only partially there now. And every so often Baba would take his hand off Francis's shoulder and walk a few steps. And one day he indicated that I was going to walk with him. And again, I'm sorry, but I was just absolutely terrified. And he put his hand on my shoulder, and not the weight of the world, but there was so much more energy there than we can imagine. And this is the most difficult part I have when I talk about Baba. How do I transcribe and say it wasn't just his hand, which could be very gentle. It was a hand that really held you, and there was enormous energy and weight in it. And we marched up and down. And we got to the end of the second marching up and down, and Baba gave me a push, and he walked all by himself. And that was the first time he walked completely up and down by himself. And all the surgeons, and obviously the very best had been used, had said he would never walk again. But the strength of this pushing me away and the energy in his walk was just extraordinary. One of the days that I was there, I had what I call my own time with Baba. And I have really very poor recollection of how it happened. I know I walked across to Mandalay Hall. I was just sitting there very quietly when Baba came in, and no one was with him, which did happen occasionally. Baba would be by himself occasionally. And my terms again, we had a conversation. And Baba would repeat the gesture, repeat the gesture, repeat the gesture, and I would be doing my absolute damnedest to think, well, what is he trying to tell me? What does he want me to know? What does he want me to see? And it was absolutely fantastic, because he absolutely, again my term, talked to me. I mean, there was real communication. It was only for a few minutes, but I got the gestures, and he just loved it. He just beamed, and he smiled, and he hugged me, and it was beautiful. Very, very special and very unique. And we were all sitting in Mandalay Hall one day, and the big bell rang, and Kakabad went running off to see who it was, and came back and told Baba that there were these Iranians that had come to see him. And apparently they come by train, and it had taken them 3 weeks. And Baba said, you know, I'm in seclusion, everybody knows I'm in seclusion, I don't want to see anybody, but what can I do? They've touched my heart. And they trooped in, and watching these people, I mean, I thought my journey was bad enough, theirs must have been hell on earth. But they had been determined to come and see Baba. And Baba took every single one of them, hugged them, cuddled them, touched them, talked to them, asked them about their health. And it was the most amazing lesson for me, most amazing lesson for me, of being able to understand and to see the extraordinary, amazing emotional responses that Baba gave people. And every single one of those people felt absolutely unique and special. Nobody felt left out. And later on that day, the bell rang again, and Kakabad went out and Kakabad could be quite furious if he wanted to be. He was very feisty. And he was just rah, 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 rah. And he came back, and he came in with this, how can I describe him? I suppose scrawny is the word I would use if he was here. He might not like that. And it was an American merchant seaman called Harry Denelchild. And Harry was a character. Those of us who had the pleasure of knowing him, he was absolutely wonderful. And he came in, and his ship was docked for 72 hours in Bombay. He'd hired a taxi and come to see Baba. Well, he marches into Mandalay Hall with 2 enormous suitcases, and I mean enormous suitcases. And Baba took no notice of the suitcases, because my interest, I was, why do you think he's come for 2 days and he's got 2 enormous suitcases? And of course, Baba never miss the trick, and so he saw me looking, and so he said to Harry, Alain's curious, what's in your suitcases? So Harry opens up one of the suitcases, and there's cartons upon cartons upon cartons of American cigarettes, which in India in those days would have been worth a fortune, because they were almost impossible to get in. And Baba looked directly at me, I mean not to the left, to the right, but right at me, right in my face, and said, "Do you smoke?" So I said, yes, Baba, I do. And so he said, well, which of those do you smoke? So I said, well, I would generally smoke Salem because they're mentholated. So Baba takes out, or Erich takes out and gives to Baba the carton of Salem. Baba hits me on the head with them and says, you can smoke, but you mustn't smoke more than 5 cigarettes a day. I give you my permission to smoke. And then the rest were distributed, I don't know how or what, but it was the most extraordinary lesson, it was unbelievable. And again, watching Baba with Harry Dettelchild, who spent I don't know how many months' salary renting the taxi or renting the car, come up, spend 72 hours, and it was another lesson, because later on, that's how I used to visit Baba. That's how I got there, not when Baba was alive, but afterwards, after he dropped the body. That was the way I used to be able to go to Marathon. The other piece that we used to do was Baba loved games. I'm sure everybody knows this, but it was so amazing to see this rainbow of energy suddenly go to blue, and it was like, oh, blue, we're going to play games. And it could be 7 tiles, it could be cards, it could be telling jokes, it could be doing miming. He'd even ask you to do a sketch. And because I'd lived in so many places, he would ask me to do something in French or German or in Spanish or Italian or Polish or Russian or whatever it was that I could speak in those days. And it was just fun. It was absolute, simple fun. It was just delightful, it was just wonderful, it was just amazing. And they used to go out and play 7 tiles, and Francis was a real whiz at 7 tiles. And after they played a couple of games with me, they realised I was useless. I couldn't aim for toffee. And so when it came to choosing sides, I was always the last one, you know, we'd take him because we have to type thing. And Baba would sit there in his chair and he would smile and beam and clap. And one day we were playing, and it was obvious I was not going to be chosen until the very last minute, and Baba called me over and tapped me on the shoulder and said, off you go. And so I went. Every single time I had the ball, I knocked the 7 tiles flying. Well, suddenly I was the most popular man. It was absolutely hilarious. And so for several days we would do the 7 tiles, and I'd be winning and I'd be winning, and then one day Baba called me over and tapped me on the shoulder. And you know what happened, don't you? I couldn't throw the toffee. What a magnificent lesson. But it was done so simply and so elegantly. And they played this incredibly complicated card game, which I never really understood. And I used to be a bridge player, so I had an awareness of bridge and cards. But this one I never got. And so Baba used to sit there, and he'd point the cards, and I'd think, well, and I'd do the best to follow his instructions. And one day it finally dawned on me, oh, I've got a winning, I really have the winning hand. And I pointed to Baba, and I thought, oh, I'm going to get a big hug and a big pat. Instead of which Baba takes my head, puts it on his feet, and rubs my nose in the floor and his feet. And I was so upset, and I said, but Baba, I just won. And he said, yes. And again, it was one of those things, you don't think about it at the time, you only think about it in retrospect. One of the other days when I had partial time with Barbara, but Erich was there too, and partway through he called Don in, and Barbara asked me, he said, you have to decide what you're going to do with your life, what do you want to do? You've come to me, that piece is done, now get on with life. And in those days, because I spoke languages, I didn't necessarily read or write them, but I'd learned them colloquially. I said one of the things I thought of doing was being an interpreter. I'd done a little work in France as an interpreter. And I loved interior design, not interior decorating, but how we shape rooms, how we focus rooms. And I said, I'm really curious about people. And there wasn't a nanosecond pause, and Barbara said, psychology. And I thought, psychology? What's psychology? Now, 20-year-olds today know what psychology is. 20-year-olds in 1959 did not know what psychology was. There were only 2 universities in England that gave psychology courses in those days. So, at that point, Don was called in, and he was told that he had to provide and make sure I had the education I needed. And Barbara then said to both of us that I would go through very, very difficult times. I would be doing something that he wanted done, and that I would be doing his work, and he would always, always be with me. He would never, ever let me down, no matter what. And he said he did not like the way psychology was at that time, and that it had to be changed, and there were several of us, and I was very different, one of the ones who had to be the precipitator to make that change. You know, I'm sorry, I had no idea what Noel was talking about. I hadn't even a glimmer, I hadn't even a hope, I hadn't even a feather floating of what it was all about. I wouldn't even have known where to start. And we had several sessions where Barbara would sit and again go through the same thing. It's got to change, we've got to do different things. And the last thing that he said in one of these days was, you can communicate with me. I will always be there for you to communicate with. And again, what did that mean? I'm blissed out, I'm in India, I'm not sure whether I'm coming or going, I'm having a romance, I'm speaking with somebody who I realized without any question whatsoever was God. There was no question in my mind whatsoever. It was there, it was clear. And so we got to the point where there were things that Don needed to do, so Don and Barbara and some of them in Mandalay would be working, and I never felt excluded. I felt it was just appropriate that I was not there in those things. And then one day Barbara asked me to go and see Mohammed the Masked. And so, again, the Blue DeSoto, yay, my lovely Blue DeSoto. We hop in the car and off we go, and I walk up to Mohammed, and Mohammed says to me in perfect French, "J'étais dans votre pays." And I've been hearing all about this man and how he was a master and how he didn't talk and how he didn't do this and how you couldn't wear a watch. And of course I'd forgotten completely and had my watch on. And he and I had and thank goodness there were witnesses, but he and I had a conversation in French. And every time afterwards I went back, the first thing he would say was bonjour. And for years I would go, and Erico took care of him, and Erico would say, yes, you can see him today, and I would walk up and he'd say bonjour. I found it absolutely an extraordinary and amazing piece. I never got to grips with it, it didn't matter, it was just one of those beautiful things you accepted. Am I talking too much? Have I gone on too much?
No, carry on.
Barbara's compassion was profound in a way that we have very little experience of. We're going through this horrible period at this moment in time where everybody wants to bomb everybody. And one day it was announced that there were a group of lepers coming to see Baba, and he was going to give them darshan. And in the past, when darshan had been given to lepers, it was always Francis who held the umbrella above Baba when he gave darshan. And Baba would have a white band on his head. He would have somebody at the side to give him, I think they were like something like 10 rupee notes, which was quite a lot of money in those days. And he would wash their feet and bow down to them and bless them. And the lorries eventually arrived with these. I'm having difficulty, sorry, bear with me. Baba turned and said, you have to understand, you need to understand, you have to understand, you need to understand. These are beautiful birds in ugly cages. And at that point they were helping the lepers off the lorry. And dear Francis, who was quite a character and couldn't stand me, which is fine, rushed out and grabbed the umbrella and was ready to assist Baba. And Baba turned around and took the umbrella out of his hand and put it in mine. What do you do? So I stood holding, it's in a film, so it's public knowledge. I stood and my arm literally froze into position. And eventually when Baba took a break and then came, I couldn't bring my arm down. I could not move my arm for half an hour. And afterwards I had to go back out and hold the umbrella again. Baba absolutely insisted on it. I have never felt, I've never seen, and I've been in some extraordinary places and situations in my life, anything like what those beautiful birds in ugly cages received from Baba that day. And I received too. And everybody around received. And Baba was running. I mean, running with sweat. He was soaked. And they were constantly bathing him, they were constantly changing the white band. It didn't matter. He just was so compassionate. It was extraordinary. And you had to have been there to experience it. And we sat afterwards, and I had no idea where I was, and I remember that Kakaba the next day said to me, you had 4 cups of tea yesterday, and 3 biscuits. You were only allowed 2 cups of tea and 1 biscuit. Well, I guess they'd let me have it, but it was just one of these, bring it back down to the mundane pieces that we were given. At one point in my journey with Baba, I was sitting with him, and Erich was there, and we were waiting for people coming in, and Baba said, do you have a question? I said, yes, Baba, I have a question. Don is a Sufi. Should I become a Sufi? Since I'm in a relationship with Don. And clouds came over the sky, in my opinion. And Baba, in my sense, was angry, and he said, why would you become a Sufi? And I said, well, because Don's a Sufi, and generally the Sufis are couples, what little I knew about him. And he said, you come to me, you're mine, you do not need to become a Sufi. However, you will, with my guidance and help, be of great use to Ivy, and I want you to be involved with Ivy, and I want you to support Don in his Sufi work, but you are not to become a Sufi. But you will be there and be useful. And again, I had no idea what that meant. I had only met a couple of Sufis. And so I said fine, and people came in, and the general business of the day started. And the worst part for me was not saying goodbye to Baba, but the last day we were there, Baba said again, now what is it you'd like? And I thought, joke time. And I said, I'd like a Porsche mint coat and a ring. And Baba thought that was very funny. a Porsche, a mink coat and a ring. I got all three. I ended up with a mink coat, I ended up with, and but I thought it was a joke. And then he repeated the question, and I said, you know, Barbara, I need to be very honest, I'd like to be sitting at your feet with a begging bowl. And Barbara, for me, that was the only time I would say that he expressed anger towards me. And he said very clearly and very emphatically, even Erich made it very emphatic, and it was very emphatic from Barbara. If I wanted you here, you'd be here. You have to go out into the world, you have to be of the world, you have to participate in the world, you have to suffer in the world. Go. And that was the last time I spent physically with Barbara. That was my goodbye.
Which year would that?
Thank you so much.
Which year would that be?
In 1960. Don was doing lectures in Mumbai, this very powerful American businessman, and Barbara had arranged for me to go and see a very famous Hindu astrologer. No one has ever told me why. Mayurji was furious because he hated going anywhere near anything to do with astrology, but he had to do it because Barbara. And Mayurji got very angry with me because I wanted to go to the Elephanta caves, which I didn't realize were a spiritual place. Again, naivete. And Don and I went back and continued living in Holland. I applied for Oxcam and the SAT, which is the American entrance exam, and was given a scholarship to America. Don was suddenly transferred back to America. So I ended up going to university in America. I ended up doing an enormous amount of work with Ivy Dews, Merchant Dews, for whom I had an enormous amount of respect and love. She was an incredible human being. I had to spend a little while here doing some crash work in biology because I'd never done biology in school. And Barbara said, I want you to go to the London group. So I went to the London group, and the London group in those days was in off Kensington High Street. And I went in, and it was rather like going to a meeting of the Eastern Star, because there was Delia in that corner, Charles Purdom in that corner, William Mary back in that corner, and Douglas and Molly Eve in this corner. And it was like nobody connected with anybody. And I found it very, very difficult and very painful, and it didn't feel like a Bible group to me. Very old people. I mean, I was 21, so they were very old people, and now I'm a very old person. I got called an elder the other day, which was rather interesting. Anyway, the piece was that I listened to these people and I thought, this is not a Bible group. I don't want to be here, but Barbara has said I should come. So I sent a letter to Marnie explaining what I was experiencing. And the people that were just so special for me were Douglas and Molly Eve. They were the most extraordinary, wonderful and amazing people I could possibly ever have met. And they were lovely, lovely to me. They took wonderful care of me. And so I sent off this little missive because Barbara had said, write to me, so I did. And about 5 days later, the post worked in those days. Letters got everywhere very fast. They don't anymore. I got a telegram from Barbara saying, do you love me? I went back to the group. And I continued to do my best. And of course, I was so young and so innocent and so naive that I caused all sorts of ructions. And I have to tell you this one story because it really was too funny for words. I couldn't understand why Barbara didn't have a centre in London. London was the centre of the world. And there wasn't a centre. There was this little room that was rented. And so I said to Delia one day, Delia, I've started doing the football pools. And if I can win the, does everybody know what anybody not know what football pools are? Right, anyway, so I figured if I won the football pools, because of course Barbara was behind me having asked me to go to the group, we would have a centre, fabulous. So I was doing all the football pools, and Delia said, Darling, don't tell Charles or Will and Mary, they wouldn't understand. So yours truly, being yours truly, told Charles, who said, load of nonsense, absolute rubbish, but do it. Somebody's got to win. And then I went to tea with Will and Mary Backett, and tea with Will and Mary Backett was an event that beyond anything. Mary finally taught me how to weave and woof and card wool and do all sorts of fabulous things. And they both leant forward, and for those of you who knew or saw pictures of Will, he was a mischievous man. He was a very mischievous man. And he leant forward and he said, would you spend any of the money on yourself? Or is it just for Barbara? And Mary said, I think that's delightful, dear. And I'm getting all these messages that you can't talk, and I'm doing this funny little communication thing. And Douglas Lee said, who was an actuary and a very, very clever one, he said, well, of course, the chances of winning are so small that I wouldn't worry. And this morning, the headline in one of the Sunday newspapers is, chance of winning the lottery is 1 in whatever it is, and you're more likely to be eaten by a shark. And I thought, that's the story I have to share today. Am I going on too long? Stop.
No.
We're a little bit over. What should we do?
5 minutes, Alain.
5? Okay.
Yes.
And so that was my English connection. The connection in...
Did you win?
No, well, yes, we did. We won 10 shillings. Doesn't start a centre.
Did you spend any of it on yourself?
No, I bought biscuits. You could buy biscuits cheaply. I didn't buy broken biscuits, I bought broken biscuits. And then the amazing things that happened in America. I mean, I could sit here for another 5 hours and tell you how Barbara guided me, supported me, challenged me. There was a whole big drama with Don and Ivy Deuce about having men or women who were homosexual, gay, I don't like the expression gay, but homosexual, in order. And a couple of young men had come and worked with Don, because Don was one of the people who worked very closely with Ivy, as many of you know. And he was very upset by it, and so we helped to start another group, the Barbara group in Berkeley. That was one of the pieces we did. And when Don and I came to live in London for a while, and we helped, Don and I really ran and paid for the little Barbara Centre that was on Wardour Street, which used to be Pete Townsend's office. And that was another drama. But in America, Barbara just laid out one thing after another for me. School was extraordinary, it was very challenging, it was very different. One of my first psychology teachers, who was my mentor in the 3rd year, which was the most difficult year, committed suicide, leaving notes that she was fallen madly in love with me, and she couldn't deal with the fact that she had a patient-client relationship with me and she'd fallen in love. That was one of the most devastating pieces I went through. It was just unbelievable. And Barbara helped a lot with that. I don't think there is any extent correspondence about that, but that was a very, very creative part. I started to work with severely handicapped children, and my first, the first patient I had, used to pull out her fingernails. She was 7 years old and she wouldn't talk. And we had therapy every day, and I used to go home, bury my head in the blankets in my bed and howl. And I used to say, Barbara, how could you allow this to happen? And I wrote, and Money wrote back and said, remember what Barbara told you. And Barbara had, this is a whole another side, at some point shared with me sanskaras, karmas, and how they had to be used in psychology. And it took me, I would say, a good 20 years before I really realized the whole issue of karmas and sanskaras in psychology. After 11 years, we went to the last darshan, Don and I together. And on the way to the last darshan, we met in Rome a friend of mine, was a friend of mine. and he and Don fell in love. Don had had other relationships outside our relationship, as did I. Eventually, we just got to the point where there was no relationship anymore. Couldn't be kept together. And I came back from last Darshan, and Don asked me to move out, and Claude moved in. And I went to the north of England and I started doing a PhD program at Leeds University. And then I went to Canada on my way back to America and stayed for 2 years. And I worked from 7 o'clock in the morning till 10, 11 o'clock at night. And I must have done about 3 PhDs in the work in the hospitals that I worked in. I worked in the Jewish General, I worked in the Children's Hospital, I worked with Inuit, now known as Native Canadians. And Barbara gave me so many experiences, and the loneliest place I've ever been was Canada, and yet it was in many ways the happiest place, because that was one of my closest times with Barbara, because I could constantly be in touch with Marnie, I could constantly be in touch with Barbara, and he supported me through all the challenges of all the work I did. And even to this day, I mentioned to you earlier this whole point, that it was so amazing that this woman had held on to this thing for all these years, and it was the most amazing piece of karma and samskara work. And we have to work it out our way. Thank you so much for listening. It has been absolute joy, and I'm deeply touched. And I have to say, in reality, I'm very honoured to be here at the reopening of this Bala Centre. Thank you. Please, no applause.
No problem. No problem.
So let's sit, please, and
Alain, will you come back and tell us the other stories?
anytime I'm invited, if I can, of course I will.
Is he invited?
Yes.
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 Yes. Could we just take one moment to say a special thank you, Alain, to you and to Kaz this morning. It's been wonderful. We probably need a little time just to get the food set up. I'm going to open upstairs if anybody wants to go up and see the dress code or sit quietly up there for a bit. And we'll have to just arrange chairs and everything. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you.
I'll open up the front.
Avatar
Meher Baba ki jai. Avatar Meher Baba ki jai. Avatar Meher Baba ki jai.
And one more. Baba Kodai Ji! Baba Kodai Ji! Baba Kodai Ji!